Hi, everybody. Welcome to Horsepower Heritage. I'm Maurice Merrick, and greetings to all of you listening from places like Tappahannock, Virginia, LaGrange, Kentucky, Albuquerque, New Mexico, Pisa, Italy, Laeken, Switzerland, and Brighton, England. Thanks for joining me and for telling your friends about the show, because I can see you're doing that. I look at the download data, and it's always fun to see how far the show is reaching, certainly in the English-speaking world, but there's always a few surprises every week. So anyway, I appreciate you spreading the word. Keep it up. Don't forget to rate and review the show. And I've been working hard on the rest of this year's episodes. There's some really varied guests and topics that are coming up. And not counting today's episode, we've only got 4 left before the new year. Is it just me, or does it always seem like October, November, and December just fly by? I don't know what it's about, but man, it just goes whoosh, and there never seems to be enough hours in the day to get everything done this time of year, and I've been trying to stay ahead of the game. I've got projects in the garage that I'm making progress on, but not as fast as I'd like, so they need attention. And also, this is the time of year here in Southern California when I want to get out on the motorcycle as much as possible, so there's that. But I must say, this is my favorite time of year, and I don't know, maybe that's why it goes by so fast, because it is true that time flies when you're having fun. Anyway, I'm rambling, so enough of that, and let me tell you about today's show. It's a conversation with Robert C. Yeager. Bob is a lifelong car guy and writer, and many of you, I'm sure, have read his work in the New York Times, where he's been a regular contributor for over a decade. And now he's written what I think is a great comprehensive book for anyone in the car hobby, but especially for newer enthusiasts. It's called The NextGen Guide to Car Collecting: How to Buy, Sell, Live With, and Love a Collectible Car. And it's published by Motor Books, and it just came out, so it's hot off the presses. And it's got history, market analysis, lots of good details on specific nameplates and desirable automobiles. But what's really cool about the concept is that Bob wanted to do his part to keep the car hobby alive by helping younger fans get their bearings in the car culture. And I'm all about that too. But even if you're a veteran car enthusiast and you've done some deals over the years, there's so much great stuff in the book, I think you'll enjoy it as much as I did. And that's coming up right after this. Hi guys, Maurice Merrick here, and I don't know about you, but I think Santa Claus is a car guy, which is why this year you should definitely put a pint-sized machine on your wish list from Model Citizen Diecast, like Kyosho's 1973 BMW 2002 Tii in 1/18 scale, with doors that open and wheels that steer. Or how about the 1960 Le Mans winning Briggs Cunningham Corvette in 1/18 scale by Real Art Replicas? Or a collection of vintage racing Porsches in 1/43 scale by Spark? Go to modelcitizendiecast.com and use the promo code HERITAGE at checkout, and you'll get 10% off your order. Limitations apply. It's Model Citizen Diecast for Christmas, because your inner child still wants to play with cars. And now my interview with Robert C. Yeager, right here on Horsepower Heritage. Bob, thanks for coming on the show.
You're welcome. It's an honor and a privilege.
Well, I really appreciate your time today. And, you've been writing for the New York Times on cars for over a decade, right? But today we're going to be talking about your new book, which is The NextGen Guide to Car Collecting. And although you've written fiction before, this is your first automotive book, right?
Yes, it is. It really kind of grew out of my love of cars, which goes back to when I was a kid, really, and my reporting at the Times, because the further I got into writing about collectible cars for them, the more I started to sense that the business landscape of vintage cars and collecting cars was beginning to really change in a very fundamental way. When I started covering the subject for them, really most of the collectors were people who were in their 60s, maybe a little older even, and the people who ran things like Pebble Beach and auctions and stuff were expressing concern that there weren't enough young kind of gateway collectors coming in. Not real young, but people say in their late 30s and 40s, early 50s, who had some resources and could get into it. And then, I don't know, sometime around the mid-teens, and I sort of peg it around the sale of this car that had been owned by Gary Cooper, it seemed like the landscape changed. The Cooper car was auctioned, I think, in 2014, and the odds on it was sold by David Gooding during the Monterey Car Week. And the betting had been the car would bring maybe $10 million. Instead, it brought $22 million.
And Bob, that was a Duesenberg, right?
Yes, it was. It was a Gary Cooper, the actor Gary Cooper's Duesenberg. There were only two made. It was in original condition, and but it became the most expensive American car ever publicly sold. That not only highlighted the investment potential of collectible cars, which had really been kind of growing ever since the so-called Great Recession, in the 2008, 2009. And it underscored that they were becoming a valuable asset. And about that same time, I started hearing from people who were in the auction business, people who worked at Pebble Beach and so forth, that there was definitely a younger element coming into the hobby. So I checked with the people at Haggerty, who really, boy, they track this stuff, very carefully. And sure enough, the age numbers were starting to change, and younger people were getting involved. I think one data point was that, very surprising one, was that among the $10 million and up cars, after the boomers, the people that are in their 60s and 70s, the next group were high-tech millennials. And that was certainly a surprise. And another thing, which is also in the book in my chapter on women, Haggerty and some other companies, one in England, an advertising company, but Haggerty was beginning to track growing interest in vintage cars among women. And it was still, and as an absolute number, it was still small, but the percentage growth was kind of impressive. I think it was around 20% over a several year period. So I gradually thought to myself, these gateway collectors are out there, and really there should be a book for them. I outlined a book, pretty much the one that I wrote. And McKeel Haggerty, I forget exactly how he connected with it, but he got interested in it and very enthusiastic about it and supported it.
And McKeel getting excited about this, obviously he's a big enthusiast, but it's also sustaining for his business as well, because as the car collector population sort of is aging, you need new customers, you need new traffic to their media and so forth. So it serves a dual purpose for him. Now, he wrote the introduction to the book, right?
Yes, he did. What I loved about his introduction is that he really kind of chronicled his own journey with a collectible car. And it was a Porsche 911 that he and his father found in a snowbank in Michigan. They dug it out of the snowbank, and it was, of course, rusty and all the things that cars get when they're in snow. And they restored that car. And, it was a great way to open the book, because there are many examples throughout the book of these father and son projects that bring the people together and are just a wonderful experience for families. And McKeel talks a lot about it, and we have photographs when he was a teenager working on the car and with his dad. And today, McKeel still owns that car. It's been completely restored now. It was originally polo red, but when they dug it out of the snowbank, it was black. So as they've had the car all these years, they've done the whole car over.
Yeah, I love the multi-generational aspect of that story. And also, I think I've heard McKeel say that that's the one car he'll never sell.
Oh, no, he never would. No.
What I like about the book is that it's a compendium. It's not raw data about car values and specs and all of that, but it's a very comprehensive primer on car collecting, the hobby, the history, the people involved, and what it requires to own, maintain, restore classic cars. So you've got nice broad brushstrokes, but there's enough specificity in it that it's a useful guide at the end of the day as well. Maybe we should start by getting your personal definition of collectible car.
Well, I think I would call it something with style and speed and no longer made. That starts it off. When I first started writing for the Times, a collectible car was generally a car from the 30s, maybe 40s. But today, those bands of desirability have moved up to include cars all the way into the 90s. And that's great. And that's the younger next-gen buyers are driving a lot of that. The first self-propelled car was the Cuño steam car in 1769. It was a very difficult car to drive because of the way the weight was distributed. And in fact, it also became the first automobile involved in a motoring accident. It was driven into a brick wall or something. And eventually, Carl Benz patented what is considered the first real automobile, which was the Motorwagen in 1896. That was the springboard. Then along came electric cars, which were very popular. And actually, in the year 1900, electric cars outsold gasoline cars. Henry Ford's wife drove an electric car until 1914. But electric cars had, they had drawbacks of their own. Some may sound unfortunately familiar today, but the batteries and other shortcomings of range, limited range, and so on. And by 1930, the electric cars were gone. But around 1930, maybe in the 20s, really, we started to see the coach-built cars that were, like Duesenbergs and Hispano-Suizes and Talbot Lago and all those wonderful cars that coach builders sprung up to make bodies for them. And you would when you bought a car, you were just getting a chassis.
I want to get into those foundational chapters, the automotive origins, because that's really what you're talking about right now. But let's take a little bit of a detour for a second, because I want the audience to be able to get to know you a little bit through your own personal car passion. So you're an Alfa guy, right? What is it that you liked about Alfas?
As a kid in high school, I remember I would go to the Italian car dealership in Beverly Hills and press my nose against the glass and go inside and marvel at these gorgeous machines. And we bought an Alfa Romeo GTV as our first family car. And it was a wonderful car. And my experience with Alfa Romeos has just been really, really good. They make great engines, or they did anyway, in the vintage ones. The GTV that we bought was a much more advanced car than the then current BMW. It had 5-speed transmission, disc brakes all around, a double overhead cam aluminum engine. It was just a piece of it, beautiful engineering. And of course, then after that, I went backwards. And my next Alfa was a 59 Giulietta Spider, what they called a Series 750 Spider. And that was just a hoot of a car to drive. Oh, boy, was it fun. And those little Alfas really, I think, put them on the map, the 4-cylinder ones from the 50s. But after I'd had that one for a while, a friend of mine in the Alfa Club introduced me to the 2600 touring-bodied Spider. And it was so beautiful, and it had a really powerful engine. The car was, unfortunately, it had some drawbacks, but you just grew to love them. It really didn't handle like it should. Alfa didn't put the energy into getting a wide enough tire size and maybe the right suspension. But from the standpoint of the engineering of the motor, and it also did have disc brakes all around, and it had terrific torque, and the body was just gorgeous. So I had that car for a number of years and showed it and won awards and so on. And when I sold the car, I actually, and this goes to my chapter on love, there were tears on my cheeks when I saw it cross the block. My daughter had sat when she was a little girl in the back seat. My dog had loved to ride in the back. And, you have those kind of human connections with cars, and they're really compelling.
By the way, this makes me think of something which you address in your book, which is that classic cars, they're beloved, and there's wonderful things about a given car, but there are also hidden dangers in buying a classic car. For example, Alfas were notorious for rusting prematurely.
Oh, yes. Most European cars were. I don't think it was particularly a distinctive Alfa problem. You had to be careful with, I think a lot of the European makers were getting Russian steel, or at least that was kind of the scuttlebutt, and it was rust prone. Now, I had the great good fortune of living in California. And if you lived in California and you garaged your car, it was much less of a worry than if you were in the Midwest and, driving on snowy roads and that sort of thing. But rust was definitely a problem. Alphas were also said to be prone to weak transmissions on second gear. I just never had that problem with any Alpha. They were very bulletproof cars. The 2600, for its shortcomings in terms of suspension, it was incredibly reliable. Yeah, that engine it's just a shame Alpha didn't stick with that straight six overhead cam aluminum engine that they had in the 2600.
Yeah, they're pretty rare, aren't they, compared to the 1300 and 1600?
Yes, they only made a little over 2,000 of those cars, and they were hand built coach built cars.
Yeah, I imagine that was probably, one of those corporate rationalizations that, from a financial standpoint, it didn't make sense for them to keep building it.
Yeah, I think the engineering costs might have been substantial if they'd wanted to really continue with it.
Incidentally, there's always kind of a debate among the Alfisti which they prefer, the 1300cc or 1600cc four-cylinder. What's your personal preference?
Well, the 1300 was the more classic car. The 1600 never had quite that delicate look that the 1300 did, but the absolute bullseye for the 1300 is the Veloce series, which had a little bit more horsepower, a little more crank, but otherwise visually and so on and handling wise, they were pretty much similar to just the regular Giulietta Spider.
Yeah, I hear Alpha owners talking about how they love that the 1300, you can just wind it out. And
oh, yeah, it was amazing.
Small displacement, but just lots of fun to drive at high RPM.
Just terrific car to drive.
Well, Bob, there are some foundational chapters in your book that I think we ought to give people an idea about. For example, you begin the book with automotive origins, which I would sort of characterize this as the period of history where automobiles go from sort of proof of concept and a crude but functional machine, and then they're elevated into an art form by the late 20s, early 30s. Is that a pretty good description?
Yes, because in the late 20s and 30s, coach builders became very prominent, and for companies like Duesenberg, Hispano Suizes, and Talbot Lagos, and cars like that, they were all coach-built cars, so that what you bought was the motor and the chassis, and then you went to a coach builder and had the body put on. Like the car, for example, that just won Best in Show at Pebble Beach is a 1932 Duesenberg with a Fagoni body. There was only one car like that ever made, so the production runs on the bodies were very small, and that's when, and I get into this in the book a bit. The some of the concepts of design. I think, for example, Hispano Suiza. They had built aircraft engines in World War I for the French, so they were very influenced by aerodynamic forms and by nature. And it was during the 30s that the kind of teardrop design came about. The daughter of Franco Scaglione, who was a famous designer of Alfa Romeo's cars. He designed the Bat cars and the Gullwing Stradale cars of the 1950s and 60s. And what she wrote was, quote, his dream was of an automobile that, like a falling drop of rainwater in the air, could glide along with only the slightest turbulence and with the least friction possible. A car that could travel quickly without disturbing the outside air or creating whistling noises inside the cockpit. And I think that quote really exemplifies kind of the approach to design, especially by the finer coach builders of the 30s, 40s, and early 50s.
Yeah, that's absolutely true. And the other guy that immediately comes to mind, of course, is Hans Ledvinka of Tatra, who really embraced that shape. Also, Raymond Loewy.
Oh, yes.
Industrial designer. There's a whole list of individuals who contributed to that movement in styling. They really invented automobile styling. Another chapter in the book is called Consolidation and Quality. Give us an idea of that part of the automotive story.
Well, it's really, part of the history of the automobile. Of course, what happened was the huge impact of the Great Depression in the 30s started to winnow the field of automotive manufacturers, particularly high-end manufacturers like Ruxton, like Cord, like Duesenberg. And definitely the post-war companies like Talbot Lago, Delahaye, they all faded out. But what was going on is very interesting. As we entered the 50s, a gentleman named Edwards Deming, who was a Yale professor of physics, I think, got very interested in automotive manufacturing processes. And none of the American manufacturers pay much attention to him. But in Japan, they were struggling with an image of low quality products, from toys to, everything they made, really, and little cars that were very tinny and so on. And Deming had this philosophy, which the Japanese call kaizen, which was examining every step of a manufacturing process and every employee that touched it. And it was the pursuit of quality improvement, so that you would make little improvements, a bit by bit by bit. And gradually, as the 60s wore on, the Japanese cars became very reliable, very well made. And I had a very interesting interview with a man named Jack Keebler, who you may know. He's now an automotive journalist, but at that time, Jack Keebler was a team leader for quality improvement at General Motors. And he told me that, they got the first cars that Lexus made. They made 4 cars, 2 sedans and 2 coupes. And he said, we took those cars completely apart. And he said, we immediately discovered that when you pull the engines apart, the tolerances were minuscule compared to American cars. And the paint was thicker, the glass was thicker, and the cars were just tighter. The shut lines were tighter. And he said, when you took the cars out on the track, we knew that something seismic had happened in the automotive universe. And of course, Lexus was trying to chase Mercedes, as was Infiniti and all those Japanese cars, and they were just really blowing out the barn doors to make the best cars they could. And the American automakers stepped up their game. But it was really the Japanese that really knocked the doors off quality. And that's why I think for today's gateway collector, there's really no more fertile field to look at than 90s Japanese cars. If you can find low mileage examples, I happen to have a car from that era, a Lexus SC300 Coupe. And to this day, it has 250,000 miles on it. It's as tight as a drum, and it's just an incredible car.
Yeah, and young people are all about Japanese cars. The biggest enthusiasts in the, say, 20 to 35 age group are looking for Japanese domestic market cars.
Well, the Nissan Skyline, the Mazda Cosmo, and all those.
Yes.
Some of them are getting pretty expensive. The Toyota 2000 GT is now $1 million car.
Yeah, I think that was the very first Japanese classic car to sell for $1 million.
Yeah, I think you're right.
Let's talk about investing, Bob. Cars are now a commodity, like many other things, fine art, jewelry, what have you. It's a different mindset, isn't it?
Well, it definitely is. And this was another thing, big door opening in my mind, 2016, 2017, when I was writing for the Times. And of course, I knew about Bring a Trailer, but how profoundly that website changed the whole subject of investing. I've gotten to know Randy Nonnenberg pretty well and interviewed him several times, and just been there as watching this thing grow from the first sale they had, I think, was for 3 American cars. And they started, and they're still there in a warehouse in Potrero Hill in San Francisco. And now today they have, I think, 800,000 members. They're going to probably sell $1 billion worth of cars this year. Bring a Trailer really changed the way the whole car collecting world. It was like a supercharger. And, somebody asked me, what's the difference between something like Bring a Trailer and eBay? Well, it's all the difference in the world, because I've watched how the Randy operates, and every car that gets on that site has been curated. They really get the full story from the owner, and there just aren't too many surprises.
You're absolutely right. Bring a Trailer, I think, was the biggest disruptor in the classic car world since probably the Barrett-Jackson auction became a big deal.
Yeah.
Then the auction phenomenon just grew tremendously from there. But Bring a Trailer is ubiquitous now, and they're setting the market, which is amazing.
Well, it really is. And it's spreading. Almost all the big auctioneers now have online platforms of one kind or another. For example, David Gooding started a separate website called Geared Online. It's just really changed the marketplace and made it, I think, much more of a kind of investment-friendly environment. It really has.
On the other side of the coin, there are a lot of car hobbyists and enthusiasts who can't stand Bring a Trailer because it's pushed values up, and now a lot of cars are not attainable for regular folks.
Well, I think that's probably a fair thing to say. It hyped the market. It is unfortunate to take some people out of the market, but the other side of it, it means that cars are becoming more reliable as an investment. If you buy an old car that's well bought and it's collectible, and there's a good chance you're going to make money on it, or at least keep your value.
There's another thing I want to point out, which is that for many years, a lot of cars were simply not worth restoring because new old stock parts had dried up. You would have to fabricate a ton of stuff to restore a car. And the rise in values has also meant it's feasible to reproduce a lot of these parts where before that wasn't the case. And that's true of virtually every make that you can think of.
Oh, yeah. Just look at Hemmings and all the parts that they advertise for American cars especially.
Horsepower Heritage will be right back. Don't go away. If you enjoyed this interview with Bob Yeager, check out my conversation from last October with Paul D'Orlean, motorcyclist extraordinaire and founder of thevintagent.com. It seems like you ride all your bikes, which is really cool.
Absolutely. Yeah, I don't own a bike if I can't ride it.
And those are the kind of people I love whether it's the car hobby or the motorcycle hobby. When they become static displays, it's sort of antiseptic and it's hard to relate to. And then their stories about ownership are very much centered on values and acquisition and restoration, but they don't have those stories about, I was 2 up on my BSA back in college with my girlfriend and blah, blah, blah. That's the meat and potatoes, right?
For sure. It's all about stories. I mean, we really only care about people. I mean, how much can you care for a machine? I mean, they're beautiful, but an emotional connection, yeah, you can develop that after decades. I have a couple of motorcycles that I've owned for over 30 years that I have an emotional connection to, and they kind of speak to me. And I mean, they speak to me metaphorically in their presence, their beauty, the way they run, and the relationship I have with them, out on the road, kind of the visceral sensation. And because they're old machines, they have tremendous character. And so, yes, I would say we have a relationship of sorts, but really we create the stories around machines. And that's my whole career is, people often say, a good design should speak for itself. It's like, well, actually they don't. They don't speak for themselves at all. They're inchoate. They have no voice. You have to give them voice. And that's what the job of a person like me is to know the history, to know where this thing came from, and to know, dig up the stories that make it actually interesting to people.
That's episode 40 from October 6th, 2021. Paul is a fascinating character, and he knows more about vintage motorcycles than anyone. And now back to the show. Bob, there's a chapter in your book called NextGen Women, and I think that's worth some mention because there are women pioneers in the automotive world that, they're kind of unsung heroines.
Well, yes. And, that was a very surprising chapter in which I learned a lot. The person who just stands out to me is the Baronessa Maria Antoinette Avanzo. Here's a woman who raced against Enzo Ferrari in the early 1920s, and she was a teammate with Tazio Nuvolari. She sat beside him on an awards stand when they shared awards in a race. She was the first woman to pilot a car on the Indy 500 track. And, whoever heard of her? She was a beautiful, wealthy woman who just loved cars and loved to go fast. She said, I've done everything that I ever wanted to do. I've been very blessed with beauty, wealth, great loves, and 2 splendid children. And if the car went to 180 miles per hour, I went at 180 miles per hour. And she drove for the Alfa Scuderia that Enzo Ferrari was the team captain on. And I'd never heard of her.
Bob, you've got a chapter on buying your first collectible car successfully. There's a lot that goes into that. First, you need to sort of do a use case analysis, right? What am I going to be doing in this car? Am I going to be touring? Do I want a 4x4? Do I want a sports car or something that hauls friends? And then, of course, you got to do your research, but where do you start? And then you have to locate the car. And finally, the pre-purchase inspection, which is really the most important part.
Right. And I tried to construct those 3 chapters around the idea of the gateway collector so that you won't find any hand-built Duesenbergs in there. Because I wanted these to be cars that I felt a first-time collector could buy at a reasonable price and enjoy. And so, for example, in European cars, you always think of the Porsche 911, but I thought to myself, I remember once when I drove a Porsche 911, it's a tricky car, or can be. And it's also gone off the charts in terms of cost. And here's the 912 that's a 4-cylinder version of exactly the same car. And I just think, you can get a really good one for 50 or 60 grand. That's a whole lot better car for a starting collector to aspire to, something that they can really afford, that's reasonable, that they can keep up and everything. And I tried to be guided by that kind of equation as I went through the cars. And I did use the Haggerty bull market list as a reference, but not an exclusive one. And I included cars that I just knew were really damn good, like the Alfa Romeo GTV. I also kind of took a risk on one car that a lot of my car buddies think I was crazy to include, but it's the Cadillac Alante. I chose the last year they made them because that had the North Star V8 in it. And I urged my readers to be very, very maintenance conscious because they are known for having trouble with their head gaskets. If I had one, I think one of the first things I would do would be consider putting in a copper head gasket. But the Alante appealed to me because here's a car that is really pretty cheap these days. It's a beautiful car. It's handmade Italian body. They shipped them over in B747s. And it's kind of was Cadillac's big attempt to compete with the Mercedes SL line. And I thought, I'm going to put that in the book, even though my car buddies will all say I was crazy.
I don't think it's a stretch to project that as an emerging classic. And really, that's kind of the trick, right? I mean, who would have thought that 80s Volvos would become collectible, but they have.
Oh, yes. Yeah.
You also talk about finding your tribe, which is not just people that share the affinity for a given make or model, but also all of the support you're going to need in owning a classic car, because otherwise it can be a big disaster.
That's right. That's just so important. For example, with my 2600 Touring Alpha, without club friends and buddies and mentors, and this is very important, a great mechanic, I wouldn't wanted to have owned that car. They didn't make very many, and very few are left that are in good condition.
That's one good thing about Mercedes-Benz. They will still supply any part from any Mercedes-Benz automobile ever made. Now, it's going to cost you a fortune probably, but you can get it.
Well, I currently have 2 vintage cars. One is a Lexus SC300 Coupe, and the other one is a 1972 Mercedes 450 SL. And, they made that series of cars, that R107 series, they call it, for 18 years. And the body panels never changed. I mean, it's quite a phenomenal success story for a car like that. So I have my 92 450, which, by the way, has 56,000 miles on it, and was a one-owner car when I got it, with original paint, original interior. But the previous owner, who'd owned it until he died, had it sitting for a number of years. And so we had to pull apart the engine and put new gaskets and all kinds of stuff like that. And at one point, we had to replace a starter motor on a Friday afternoon, and we had to part by Monday afternoon, 3 days later. And the support that Mercedes offers is really hard to match. Yes, they are expensive cars, but they really have that going for them.
Another thing I like is that you've taken the time to give us a lot of personal owner stories, which is kind of inspiring. It can encourage people to get into the classic car hobby, but also, you don't talk about just it's not a bed of roses. There's a lot of challenges in ownership.
Well, you're very true. And, the personal owner stories really flow throughout the book. We start, McKeel Haggerty tells the first one. And then we talk about father sons, Kurt and Cole Glaubitz, restoring their old Land Rover Defender. Phil Lenhars, who found the car that he first saw when he was a boy, 70 years before. It was an MGTC. And one story I really love is the one about Mary Falvey's. This is a San Francisco woman, a businesswoman, whose father was a dealer in the Midwest. And he was one of the early dealers in imported cars. And at some point, the Austin Motor Company distributed about 50 cars to dealers at no cost. And they were not ever offered in production. And they were called beach cars. And they were little Austin Minis. They were open all around. And they had kind of a little rag top. And you could take them on the beach. And Mary Falvey, as a teenage girl, she and her girlfriends drove that car all around in the beach and in their wet bathing suits and everything. And so here it is, 50 years later. And Mary decides she just has to sell that car. So she goes to bring a trailer. She sells it for $240,000. That was quite a personal story. And then the story about Neil and Gary Andrew, who started restoring this car it's a Pagoda car, Mercedes Pagoda car, and he started restoring it when he was stationed in Germany in the 1970s. And the two of them, as Gary got older and so on, they worked together on the car. And in recent years, the father has started to deteriorate in terms of mentally. He's gotten some dementia. And the things that Gary said about how this car had brought them together and how much he'd learned from his father and how much more he loved his father because of their experience together with this automobile. It was very touching. And of course, I think you've interviewed Renee Brinkerhoff, and her adventures with her car. I think she's just finished a really incredible thing in the Arctic where she ran the car for Porsche. I think it's a 356.
Yeah, they took it to the South Pole. It was modified in England by Tuthill Porsche, who installed a set of tracks in the back and a set of skis in the front. And Renee and Christina are fantastic. Yeah, I've had them both on the show twice now. It's just a great story.
Well, and it's also a great story because of what she's doing. She's raising money to combat the trafficking of these children around the world. And it's just a beautiful story.
Yeah, I agree 100%. You kind of wrap up the book with a chapter called The Road Ahead, which is, where is the collectible car hobby going?
Well, I think, probably the best witnesses to where it's going were the people. I interviewed two very prominent father-son teams who luckily live in the Bay Area. And I taped their interviews and reproduced them pretty much verbatim. One is Patrick and Tazio Otis, who Patrick is 71, I think, and Tazio is 26. And they are premier restorers of vintage Ferraris and some vintage Alphas too. And they also race these cars. Patrick doesn't race them, but Tazio does. And also Bruce and Spencer Trannery, who are on the retailing side of classic cars and have been in business since the 70s. Bruce is about the same age as Patrick, and Spencer, I think, is 42. And so they really fit my demographic, if you will. And they're both so enthusiastic about where the hobby's going and the strength of the hobby, and not fazed by the advent of EVs. In fact, Spencer, I think somewhere in the interviews, he said, as soon as they make one that's affordable and really workable and so on, I'll be the first to buy it. Now, having said that, I go into some discussion about, I think personally, that we are rushing headlong into EVs in a way that we really shouldn't. Because as the Tesla owners in Florida learned, there are drawbacks to EVs. The batteries are very highly corrosive in any kind of salt water. The cars have shown a tendency to spontaneously catch on fire, and sometimes people don't know exactly why. We had a couple in Danville here, which is nearby. They had 2 Teslas in their garage, and they were charging one, and they forgot to unplug it. The car burst in fire, and the whole house burned down. They were lucky to get out. And so I'm a believer that we should let the market lead us into electric vehicles. My wife has a car that we really love. It's a little Ford that is what they call a plug-in hybrid. And, it seems like the perfect answer to me. She can plug it into household current, and, it gives her enough to go to the market and come back and that kind of thing. And sometimes she doesn't buy gasoline for weeks, but it's there if she needs it. If we have a power outage is not infrequent in California, or if there's a fire or something, boy, I want petrol. I want to have that reserve fuel that I can depend on.
I couldn't agree with you more. I think the market needs to speak on what we're going to do. It's not a zero-sum game. I think there's a place for full electric, there's a place for hybrids, and there's a place for the internal combustion engine. Emissions control technology has gotten so much better in the last 25 years. Fuel efficiency, and then the synthetic fuels, I think there's a lot of promise there. So I'm with you.
Well, the other thing I get into in the book is, and I think this is more of the coexistence angle, that, both Jaguar and Aston Martin in England, and I've written stories for the Times about it, and I have some information in the book about it, but they both produced electric vehicles. They both turned vintage cars into EVs. Now, in fact, Prince Harry and Meghan drove off from their wedding in an electrified Jaguar 120. Aston Martin developed a DB6 that's an EV. And I interviewed the president of Aston Martin for the Times, and he said, it's really beautiful to have an old car like that, and you're going around a turn, it's quiet and everything. And he said it's really a different kind of experience. And one thing I found very interesting is that a company in Britain, and this is in the book, is converting Pagoda cars into EVs. The way they do it is you have to give them enough money so they can buy the car and restore it, and they pick the car up. But then they convert it to an EV. It has around, I think, 150 or 170 range. So that's a fascinating development too. But you have to remember, and I always keep this memory in my mind, that in the year 1900, electric cars outsold petrol cars. But by 1930, there were no more electric cars. And there are still a lot of drawbacks. I mean, do we have the grid to support them? What do you do when the batteries are finished? You have to buy, I don't know, $15,000 worth of batteries or something. Lots of question marks there. It's not settled law, as the lawyers like to say. It's there's a lot of terrain that we're going to have to traverse to make that work.
That story is developing on a daily basis. It's going to be interesting to see where it goes.
It is.
Bob, really has been a pleasure. Also, the book has fantastic photography and also lots of little data tidbits. It's a handy guide in a lot of ways.
Well, I'm glad you enjoyed it. And I think really there's something in the book that most people that are interested in cars will find useful, whether they're first-timers or more experienced.
By the way, I also want to mention, Bob, you're getting some ink, some digital ink on Car and Driver's website. There's an article by Brett Burke entitled, "This Book Wants to Demystify Collector Car Ownership for First-Timers." So I'll put links in the show notes for everything that we talked about so people can easily find the book and find out more about you. The NextGen Guide to Car Collecting is published by Motor Books. It's available in stores and online now. Robert C. Yeager is the author. Bob, thanks for being with me.
Well, it's been a pleasure. Thank you, Maurice.
That's all for this episode of Horsepower Heritage, and I'll see you back here on Wednesday, November 16th for kind of a deep dive into an auto restoration topic, which is something I'd like to get into more on the show. And we'll be talking about the art and science of interior restoration with a couple of the best guys in the business. Englishmen AJ Pink and Rob O'Rourke. Don't forget, if you want to support the show, go to buymeacoffee.com/HP Heritage, and you can pitch in as little as $2, which is always appreciated. And until next time, I'm Maurice Merrick. Thanks for listening.